We're starting our new series this morning, our last series in Bill's sabbatical before he returns to us. Yeah, me too, JP. I feel the same way right now. But we're thinking about in this series what it looks like for us, to live a life of faith in the midst of our everyday, ordinary lives. And to do it, I want to start by thinking about the California redwood tree. So the California redwood tree is the tallest tree species on earth. Hyperion, the tallest of the redwood trees, is measured at 379.1 feet tall and 13 feet wide. It's a massive tree. And hundreds of feet below these redwoods on the forest floor are countless plants and flowers that grow under the shade and the protection of the trees above them. Ferns and shrubs and grass and flowering plants. And when compared to the redwoods, they can look less impressive. You go to Redwood National Park to see redwoods, right? You don't go to Redwood National Park to see ferns, obviously. And so they look less impressive, but at least in part, they're the things that allow the redwoods to grow and reach the towering heights that they reach. Their roots are all intertwined. The grass dies in season and provides nutrients to the trees. The ferns help collect moisture out of the foggy coastal air and drip it in to the roots of the trees. The flowering plants attract pollinators, which attract predators, which attract bigger predators, which bring life to the bases of these massive trees. You go to Redwood National Park and you marvel at God's creation, each 20-story tree glorifying God. It's easy for us to get caught up staring up at the canopy and that you miss the wildflowers down below glorifying God in just the same way. You miss the wildflowers supporting and edifying the trees there, stretching out above them, and you miss the wildflowers bringing life to all the small little animals that call that place home, that to them, the redwood trees must look like the Empire State Building or something greater. And when it comes to our lives, it's easy to want to be a redwood tree, to be a pillar of faith like Billy Graham or Beth Moore or even Peter or Paul, to be a titan of business like Warren Buffett or Elon Musk or Rosalind Brewer, to be a celebrity like Zach King or Kylie Jenner or Taylor Swift. There are a million different redwoods we can look to compare our failures and our successes too. But for most of us, maybe for all of us, and I don't want this to sound harsh, but really I think for most, if not all of us, we aren't going to be redwood trees. We're going to be the little flowers that grow in their shadow. And that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. That's what Paul encouraged in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The Apostle Paul says, make it your ambition to live a quiet life. Make it your ambition to live a quiet life. And over these next 5 weeks, we're going to think about what it looks like for us to live as wildflowers, to live our lives in such a way that they glorify God, that they support and edify and build up the people around us, to live our lives in such a way as to bring life to the people that we encounter. Therese of Lisieux was a Carmelite nun born in France in 1873, and she entered her convent at the young age of 15 after having to request special permission from her bishop and then going to Rome to actually get the Pope to let her in because she was too young at that time, but she was committed to the fact that this is what Jesus had called her to. She spent 9 years in the Carmelite convent in Lisieux, France, before she passed away at the age of 24. During her 9 years in the convent, Therese became known to the people there and in the community as the little flower of Jesus, because she was committed to small acts of service, to small acts of kindness, to small acts of charity and generosity. And she said of her life in her autobiography, she said, I understood that if all the little flowers wished to be roses, nature would no longer be glazed with lovely hues. And so it is in the world of souls, our Lord's living garden. And so she spent her life working to be a little flower. to glorify God, to build up and edify those around her, to live her life, to bring life to the people she encountered, even if that just meant small acts of service and small acts of charity for them. And I think that our ambition should be the same, to live a common life of uncommon faith, to be parents and accountants and students and salesmen and teachers and everyday common people, and at the same time, be marked by an uncommon faith that Jesus calls us to go to work, to go to school, to go to dinner with our families with an uncommon faith, to be the wildflowers, these little flowers scattered around the redwood trees. And you might be thinking to yourself, hey, I love that idea maybe, but I want to be a world changer, right? I want to be a go-getter. I want to accomplish something with my life, and that's great. I want that too. In fact, if I'm being honest, I want that a little too badly at all sorts of times. My parents homeschooled me when I was in middle school, and there are a lot of reasons for that decision, but the most important thing to know here was that meant that my history education from 6th grade to 8th grade was done entirely by Ken Burns, okay, and Ken Burns documentaries. And my mom, she worked here on staff at the time, so I would sit in the youth building on the stage with a laptop open, just in love with Ken Burns' gripping 9-part documentary on the Civil War. It was the absolute love of my life at 11 years old, okay? I loved this thing. And it left me with a dream. And that dream for my life was that one day I would be in a documentary where someone would very slowly zoom in on a picture of my face, and someone would narrate the decisions in my life that led to this point, right? That was my dream. Some kids want to be baseball players. Some kids want to be influencers. I wanted to be a mid-tier historical figure that only Ken Burns cranks would know about. I get this. I understand the urge to be a world changer. I understand the urge to make an impact. I understand the urge to want to leave a legacy that people will remember. I'm right there with you. But I'm not sure that that's what Jesus always calls us to. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' most defining teaching, and I love it. We're going to be here for the next few weeks, starting in Matthew 5:13, but I love this teaching because we see the way that Jesus was inviting his people, I think, to be these little flowers, to live life that are common everyday lives in an uncommon way. And I love it because we see all the time throughout the Gospels that the Gospels will say that Jesus was teaching somewhere, right? Whether it was in the temple courts or he was in a house in the community or he was out in the fields outside of a town, it'll say that Jesus was teaching, and we often don't get what he was teaching written down. But not here. In Matthew 5 and 6 and 7, we see this picture of what all that teaching would have looked like, what all that teaching must have looked like at various points. And this is what he says in Matthew 5, starting in verse 13. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Jesus said in this moment of his followers, of these very common people living out a radically uncommon faith, he said, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You help others glorify God." And what I think we're going to see over and over and over again is that if we live a common life of uncommon faith, it's going to have an impact really on two groups of people. The first being yourself, and the second being your 8 to 15, the people you do life with. Jesus said to them, right, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Salt has a purpose. Salt has a design. For us, salt is tasty. It's a seasoning. It's the seasoning, right? And as I wrote that, someone noted, hey, it's not the only seasoning though, right? To which I said, for me, it kind of is. But yeah, it's critical for us. It's important for us. And yet at the same time, in the ancient world, it was so much more. It was life for them. I'm not joking when I say that the word salary that we're all familiar with comes from the Latin word sal, which means salt, because in the late Republic, they believed that Roman soldiers had been paid in salt because of its value at some point in time. They were wrong, that never actually happened, but they thought it, and so they made the word salary out of it that way. This is how important salt was in the ancient world. This is how critical it was, that it was life-giving in this way. Salt was the most important way for people to preserve food. Without salt, meat spoiled, and meat spoiled fast, right? And in a world without accessible refrigeration, food spoiling was basically their number one concern. There was no daily trip to the grocery store. There was no weekly trip to the grocery store. In fact, right, there were no grocery stores in this moment. And so for them to get meat, they would have to sometimes travel quite a distance to a market, buy large cuts of meat, buy lots of fish at once, and they would bring it home with them, not knowing when they would go back again. And so they would salt it so that it would stay fresh, so that it would stay good, that they could continue to eat this over and over and over again. Without salt, there would have been basically no meat for anyone in the ancient world. It had an incredibly important purpose. It has an incredibly important purpose. And so do you. You have a purpose. You have a design. You have an end or a function. Aristotle called this your telos, right? He said that he argued that everything had an end or a purpose. A spoon has an end or a purpose to, scoop liquids, I don't know. A chicken has an end or a purpose to provide food and eggs. A liver has an end or a purpose to filter nutrients out of your blood, whatever all these things do, right? They have a purpose, they have a function, they have a telos, and the same thing is true about you. You are no different. The problem is that when we hear purpose, we imagine something big, something redwood tree sized. But a purpose doesn't have to be a big thing. Right? Think about Dory in Finding Nemo. What was Dory's purpose? To keep swimming, right? To just keep swimming. This is Dory's purpose. It's not a big purpose. But when we think of purpose, we don't think of Dory. We think of these great historical figures. We think, Alexander the Great's purpose was to conquer the world, or Mother Teresa's purpose was to care for the lonely and the sick and the dying, or Usain Bolt's purpose is to be the fastest man alive. And these are big purposes. These are redwood tree purposes. And sometimes your purpose might be a big thing. Your purpose might be a big redwood tree purpose. But your purpose can also just be to be the person you are supposed to be, to do the things that God has called you to do. But if you lose your purpose, if you lose your telos, you've lost yourself. Jesus says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? The wildflower aspiring to be a redwood tree will eventually lose itself entirely. It would grow taller and taller until it couldn't support its own weight anymore and collapse. And this is the same picture for us. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 says, but God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. God has put this body together with a purpose. And it doesn't matter whether you are a foot or an eye or the ear or the spleen, you have a purpose. If the ear were to try to be an eye, it wouldn't be an improvement for the body. It wouldn't be an improvement for the ear. It wouldn't be an improvement for my face probably either, right? It wouldn't be an improvement for anybody. So why is it different for us? Why would it be any different with us? God has given you a purpose and a design. Why would it be an improvement for you to live outside of that purpose or design? Why would it be an improvement for the body of Christ if you lived outside of your purpose or your design? It wouldn't be a benefit to anyone. Instead, when we embrace this life of being these little flowers, of living the quiet life that Paul described in 1 Thessalonians, of focusing in on small acts of generosity, small acts of kindness, small acts of charity, small acts of service, it's then that we find ourselves, and it's better for us. It's better for you. And it's not just better for you, it's also better for the people in your 8 to 15. In verse 14, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." And this word here at the end for house is this Greek word oikos, okay, which you might be familiar with from the Greek yogurt brand, right? Oikos. But it's a word that's a little tricky for us to translate it. We translate it sometimes as house, sometimes as household, sometimes as family. And it's a confusing word because we don't think of our house the same way that they thought about their house in the ancient world. For them, the house was, in the Greco-Roman world, the house, the oikos, was the basic unit of society. It was made up of everyone who lived in and interacted with the household on a regular basis. It would be the owner of the house, his or her immediate family, their employees, their slaves most likely. All of these people together were an oikos. We're a household, a house together. There was no nuclear family in the first century. There was an oikos. Right, if you hop in a time machine and you go back and you go to Julius Caesar and you ask Julius Caesar about his family, right? He would look at you with a confused look because he doesn't understand English first, right? That would be the first problem. And then once you got that sorted out, he would be confused again because family wasn't really the thing of importance. Your oikos was. Your household was. And it's from this idea of oikos that we've gotten this image, this idea of 8 to 15. Right? The 8 to 15 people that psychologists say you interact with in your life on a regular basis. And our oikos, it's not just our immediate family. It's not just our nuclear family. It's the people then that we do life with. These 8 to 15 people who are in our life in a regular way. It's your siblings. It's your coworkers, your neighbors, your boss, your trainer, your friends, your parents, whoever it is that you interact with regularly. And when you live a common life of uncommon faith, you shine a light to your oikos, to your household, to your 8 to 15. And again, it's not a light marked by these big, grand gestures. It's not a blinding light in people's face. It's marked by small acts of kindness, of love, of service. My son Jude is 5 years old, and a few months ago, he started to get really scared of the power going out at night. And so he started sleeping with a little LED flashlight next to his bed, just in case. And it was all well and good for a while until he started getting in this habit of every night as you're putting him to bed and you're trying to read to him, he would kind of grab it by the lanyard part and just start swinging it around like wild, right? And you were in danger of all sorts of things. You could get hit by it. You could get he'd turn it on so it's like a strobe light. You could take a LED beam straight to the retina and just be blind. And you're trying to explain to him, please stop doing this, It makes it very difficult for me to read this book to you right now. But there's no arguing with a 5-year-old, right? And so we would do this over and over again. And I think that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we think we are shining God's light to people, when the reality is that what we're doing is we are taking God's light and we are shoving it so directly into their faces that they're blinded by it. Jesus doesn't say to the disciples, you are the light of the world. Chase everyone around with this light. Jesus said to the disciples, you are the light of the world. place it somewhere on high in your household, and it will give light to everyone around you. I think about Michael, my brother-in-law, who works here with me, and he recounted to me not that long ago that one day him and a friend were down in Huntington Beach, and they were kind of hanging out, and his friend has no commitments to Jesus, no connections to Jesus at all. And so they were down there doing whatever they were doing, and some people came up to them, well-meaning people who wanted to share the gospel, the good news of Jesus, and so they came up to evangelize to them. And they came up and they started out, trying to guess their names and prophesying over them. Then there was some speaking in tongues and some praying for an extended period of time there. And then they left after quite some time. And Michael's friend kind of turned to him and he said, "Man, is that what church is like? I do not want to be a part of that." And I thought about, for Michael, here's someone who I think he would say is on his 8 to 15, someone he's been trying to show Jesus' light to for quite some time. And now what has happened is that someone has just blinded him with what he thought was sharing the light in the first place. And they meant well. They intended to do well in this moment, but now Michael has more work to do. Contrast this with the story, with the life of Roylene Walton. And I think many of us here, many of you knew Roylene. She was a faithful member of our church here for over half a century. And she was a leader in our Women of the Word ministry. She was in our choir here on Sunday mornings. She taught my mom to play piano when she was younger. She was an incredible woman of God. And when Roylene passed away a few months ago, it was crushing for a lot of us, for a lot of people here. It was a really crushing blow. And going to her funeral was difficult because even though we don't mourn like those without hope, we still mourn, we still grieve the loss for many of a friend, for many of someone who cared for them here in this community, a leader, someone they're connected to. And after the eulogies, the family opened up some time during the funeral for people to share about Roylene. And I have genuinely never been so moved at a funeral before. Because as people were sharing, so many people started to share, to stand up and share in this moment. A hairdresser of Roylene's stood up and shared about how she had gotten pregnant and she was in a difficult position. And here was Roylene, just her client, who had come to get her hair done with her. And Roylene said to her, "Oh, I'll support you. We're with you in this," and supported her. A friend of Roylene stood up and shared about how she was struggling and needed a confidant in a difficult situation. And there was Roylene, listening and hugging and caring for her in the midst of this difficult moment. A student of Roylene stood up and shared about how she was going to her piano lessons as a kid while her parents were getting divorced. And Roylene knew she just needed a friend in this season, and so Roylene was her friend. She cared for her. She listened to her. She gave her time and her attention. A neighbor of Roylene stood up and shared about how they needed a meal one night, and Roylene was there carrying a meal that she'd made for them, carrying it over to their house on what would turn out to be Roylene's final night here on earth. Roylene lived a common life. Roylene graduated from Edison High School down the street. Roylene went to church here. Roylene attended Cal State Long Beach. Roylene was married 50 years. She had 3 kids and grandkids. It was a common life, but it was a life marked by an uncommon faith. It was a life committed to small acts of generosity, small acts of kindness, small acts of service that shined God's light to everyone who was around her. It wasn't Roylene's light that shined so brightly. It was God's light that time and time again, Roylene allowed to shine through her to the people around her. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells this parable of these 3 servants that he gives these badges of gold to. And two of them, they do something with them, and one of them doesn't. And to the two who do something, Jesus, the master, turns to them and says, well done, good and faithful servant. Come and share the master's happiness. And it's hard to imagine for me that Roylene heard anything else than that. Well done, good and faithful servant. Come and share your master's happiness. Not because she was a redwood tree, not because she was some celebrity, some pinnacle of the faith around the world, but because she was a little flower who lived a common life marked by an uncommon faith and willingness to let God's light shine through her. And I want to invite us this morning to think about, how can your common life be marked by an uncommon faith? How can your common life, your everyday life, be marked by an uncommon faith? How can your common life glorify God, support and build up those around you, bring life to the people you encounter each and every day? How can your common life be like that of the flowers that grow in the shadows of the redwood trees, not trying to be anything other than what they are? How can your common life be lived out so faithfully that when you come to the end of your days, you would see Jesus before you saying, well done, good and faithful servant. Come share in your master's happiness. Come share in your master's happiness. And this morning, we're going to close our time together by sharing in communion together. And I think it's perfect for us to think about communion and the sacrifice of Jesus. In Luke 22, it says, Jesus took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. And this morning, as we take the bread and we drink the cup, I want to invite you in this time to reflect on the invitation of Jesus, the example of Jesus, to take up your cross daily and follow him. To live this daily life, this common life, this everyday life of an uncommon faith. To take up your cross while you talk with your coworkers, to take up your cross while you walk between classes in your last week of school, to take up your cross while you sit around the dining table together, to take up your cross while you go out to eat with your friends, while you talk with your kids on the phone, to take up your cross while you go through all your transactions for the week, to take up your cross while you bring a meal to a family in need, to take up your cross daily. To be reminded in this moment, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Be the little flowers that glorify God, that build up and support others, that bring life to the people around you. And let God bring the rest. So what I want to invite you to is to just take a moment to reflect in this moment on how you can live your common everyday life with an uncommon faith. And when you're ready, eat and drink and remember him.